Indomitable Heart by Renette. Chapter 17. When the mythosaur dropped into real space to recalculate their next jump, the news was good from Megiddo. The elements of the guard left there to keep order reported that all was well. Elsewhere around the rim, the droid armies were in disorderly retreat, falling back and trying to fortify their positions. The IBC would be intent on protecting their investments now, and with the Republic fleet holding Megiddo and its profitable mines under embargo, that meant playing nice with the Senate. Jango relayed orders to pursue the retreating droids and take captive any sentient in command of such an army, with special attention to be paid to General Grievous, who had proven to be one of the more apt separatist commanders and one with a well-publicized disdain for the Republic. From the Corps came less positive news. Someone had arranged to transfer Savage Opress to judicial custody for questioning by the Senate, and he had escaped while in transit. 3 Jedi had died trying to capture the Zabrak, but he had disappeared into the underlevels. Obi-Wan couldn't help but suspect Sidious had a hand in the matter. There were also early and incomplete reports of some sort of trouble at the Alderaanian Refugee Conference, at which Padme was scheduled to give the keynote address, and there was no firm news about her status or that of her Jedi protectors. Part of Obi-Wan wanted to commandeer the fastest starfighter on the mythosaur and set it immediately. What if Anakin and Ahsoka were hurt? What if they were held hostage? Obi-Wan knew that Anakin would expose himself to any and every danger in the universe to protect Padme and his Padawan. But even in the fastest starfighter on the mythosaur, it would take days for Obi-Wan to reach the core worlds, and once he did, he was only one man. A Jedi, yes, and confident in his skills, but those who worked against them, those who would target a non-combatant like Padme who was only trying to help people, those were not beings Obi-Wan wanted to meet alone. Especially as he had a strong suspicion as to who might have looked at the capable and compassionate former Queen of Naboo and seen someone who needed to be silenced. For now, Obi-Wan would have to wait, would have to trust in Anakin and Ahsoka. Such thoughts did little to quell Obi-Wan's anxiety. To try and quiet his mind, Obi-Wan threw himself into training with Jango, his squad, and any Mando'a or trooper that felt reckless enough to go toe-to-toe with them. When he'd worn himself down enough that his thoughts slowed at least a little, he would go through reports and requisitions until minutiae was all he could think about. Then he would spend time in the infirmary, folding himself down in front of the Bacta tank where Yan floated and meditating, reaching out to his master's slumbering mind and gently soothing the pain and fear that lingered there. Even with full immersion, it was clear that one of Yan's legs was damaged beyond the help of even force healing. The muscles were all but shredded, and what remained was profoundly atrophied. Even if that muscle could be coaxed into strength, the scar tissue would greatly impede his range of motion, and arthritis had settled in his hip and knee. Yan would need a brace to stand at all, and some type of mobility aid to walk. It was unlikely he would ever fight again, according to Juni Caius, the Pantoran Jedi healer. Obi-Wan wrestled with his guilt at having believed Yan dead, and then finding him alive. His meditation at least helped some with that. Half the galaxy had been between them when Yan was thought killed, and the entire Jedi Order had been misled. Obi-Wan couldn't hold himself too much at fault without also assigning blame to masters much more experienced than himself. Yan's survival and his perceived death had been due to the Sith's power. There, finally, Obi-Wan rightfully laid the responsibility. With his mind more settled, Obi-Wan threw himself wholly into doing what he could to help Jango. His Redur thanked the Force, and understood that Obi-Wan was working through something, and let him come to the solution that was right for himself. Once he made clear he was ready to work, Jango was happy to unload piles of reports on his Jedi. They plowed through data work side by side, and Obi-Wan joined Jango in the comm center aboard the mythosaur, turning his mind once more to the wider war now that they had a handle on the Master Sith and a lead on the apprentice. The mythosaur made orbit over Coruscant a week after leaving Megiddo. Usually, leaving a being in the Bacta tank for such an extended period would not have been recommended. But between Obi-Wan and healer Caius, they were able to keep Yan calm and mostly unconscious. The prolonged immersion did wonders, but even Bacta couldn't solve some of Yan's health issues. The healer warned it was likely Yan would have cognitive difficulties for the rest of his life in addition to his new physical limitations, and those would include a much higher likelihood of heart trouble. Yan was not a young man, but it was unlikely he would live to be as old as he might have otherwise. Then again, Jedi didn't often die old in their beds. That might get too slow or careless, but Jedi tended to die on their feet. Jango, Obi-Wan, the personal guards, Healer Caius, and the medic took Jango's personal ship down. Wolf piloted them, the most skilled of Obi-Wan's squad, at that particular task. He glided the vessel easily into its reserved space in the temple hangars, and Vokariche, the head healer in the temple, was there to meet them with her top team. Yoda and Mace were there as well, Yoda looking twice his age, and even Mace looking a bit wilted. They, like Obi-Wan, were wondering how they'd missed this. Behind Yan on the stretcher, Obi-Wan's squad unloaded the stasis pods. In one rested Sifo-Dyas's battered body. It would be taken to the morgue and prepared for cremation. The body of Pelagius would be gone over by the shadows, and then it too would be cremated. In the case of Pelagius, though, the cremation was not an honor, but a preventative measure. None of them knew what horrors might be wrought using the body of such a being if it fell into the hands of his apprentice or another Darksider. Once they had escorted Yan to the halls of healing, Obi-Wan trailed Mace and Yoda to the council chambers. He gave only a short debriefing, as the bulk of the mission had already been discussed via holo. Included in that brief report, though, was reiteration of Yan's declaration that Pelagius's apprentice, Darth Sidious, was Senator Palpatine. The council dissolved into disagreement, some believing Obi-Wan's report, others arguing that it simply wasn't possible. They had met Palpatine repeatedly over the years, and none had felt even a hint of darkness from him. It was clearly a well-worn discussion. They had likely been arguing over the matter since Obi-Wan sent them the information as an encrypted file shortly after Yan was recovered on Megiddo. Obi-Wan was dismissed as the counselors continued their discussion, and gladly retreated. He knew Jango would be occupied with army business for a while longer, and so he went to first check on Yan once more, then to pick up Mira from the creche. He spent the rest of his day until Jango came home, playing with their Atikad, bathing in the simple joy of Mira's presence. In hopes that Yan would wake in time for the occasion, Sifo-Dyas's funeral was scheduled for 3 days after their arrival on Coruscant. Despite that precaution, Yan slumbered yet when his old friend was commended to the pyre. Yan didn't wake fully for a week after his arrival on Coruscant, and even then he only surfaced briefly. He'd used all his strength to speak to Obi-Wan during their escape from Megiddo, and had no reserves from which to draw. Another week passed before Yan was able to wake for more than a few minutes at a time, and even then Yan was clearly confused when he did wake. Obi-Wan was on call to the healer's halls for the duration, only his presence able to calm Yan. While sitting with Yan, Obi-Wan went through all the data coming in from Alderaanian Refugee Conference with a fine-toothed comb to see if he could help discover what had happened to Padme and her Jedi protectors. Anakin and Ahsoka proved his trust in them was well-founded before he could begin planning out too serious of a rescue mission, though. Padme, Anakin, and Ahsoka resurfaced on Scipio a few days after Sifo-Dyas's funeral, claiming the senator of that planet, Rush Clovis, had abducted Padme. Anakin and Ahsoka had tracked her down and rescued her, taking Clovis into custody in the process. They also managed to slice a significant amount of data on the intergalactic banking clan and the separatists from Clovis's data suite. Anakin forwarded the information using the usual Jedi encryption codes, along with his suspicions that Clovis was working with someone highly placed in the Republic's senatorial apparatus. Obi-Wan wanted to share the full truth of the matter in his reply, but knew that doing so would be unwise, even over their most secure connection. The Separatists recovered some of their fighting metal, proving they were still receiving direction, although the next battles were mostly conducted ship to ship, as the Separatists tried to run the blockade at Megiddo and emplace a cordon of their own around Scipio. The banking clan was clearly running scared, but after the initial setback, it affected the Separatist effort as a whole far less than Jango might have hoped. Somehow, money for new droids and ships was making its way into the hands of the Techno-Union, and so their foundries continued to work. The corporate alliance likewise plowed on, raising rates and creating shortages in Republic and Separatist space alike, with the Chancellor's approval rating in the lower levels. Senator Palpatine of Naboo called for a vote of no confidence, throwing the Senate into chaos. Obi-Wan counseled his friends in the Senate as he was able, but by then he was of the opinion that the system was so broken, the Separatists might not have been entirely wrong to break off and form a new government. He knew his master would likely agree, although Jan's separatist sympathies were no secret. He had been advocating for reforms in both the government and the Jedi Order since Obi-Wan was a Padawan. Knowing his master's opinion, though, was very different than hearing Jan's exhortating rhetoric. Thankfully, Jan woke a few days after Anakin calmed that he was on his way forward from the corporate sector. Even more importantly, when Jan woke, he was alert and coherent and eager to report to the High Council.
As I'm sure my Padawan has told you, the Sith Master was Hugo Damask II,
Jan relayed before he could rise from his sickbed, his voice thin and weak, scratchy still from the breathing tube needed during his prolonged Bacta immersion.
He was addressed as Plagius by his underlings, and believed himself capable of controlling the Force to the degree that he could create and destroy midichlorians, and through that skill create and destroy life.
The councillors' shock could be plainly felt in the council chamber at that opening. If any of them had been thinking of dozing through Jan's report, that plan was quickly set aside. Jan gave a tired smirk at the stunned horror the councillors displayed. Only Obi-Wan had maintained a serene facade, although the others soon regained their placid minds.
Likewise,
Jan continued,
my Padawan has informed you that I believe wholly and fully that Palpatine of Naboo is, or rather was, Plagius's apprentice. I do not know if there is any other continuation of the line. Plagius was much displeased at the capture of Oprus, whom we did not designate as either Sith or apprentice, viewing him as an assassin at best.
Obi-Wan managed just barely not to smirk. Next time he went to the dome, he would be hunting. The council had not seemed to fully believe his own report claiming Palpatine was a Sith, although he could understand why to a degree. The man read as a null in the Force, utterly incapable of perceiving that ineffable energy, never mind using it for either good or ill. Still, they could not ignore Jan's eyewitness report as readily. Over the next few days, the council stewed and quarreled, unable to agree what their next move should be. They had no official complaints against Palpatine, no evidence of wrongdoing. It was Anakin who provided the path forward. Even before Anakin arrived back on Coruscant with his Padawan in charge, the Shadows and Gar intel began pouring through the information he had sent from Scipio. Buried deep in the data were the routing codes for a series of accounts. The Shadows on their own might have been stymied, but with the assistance of Gar military clearances and a few favors from Judicial, they uncovered clear evidence that Palpatine had rerouted Republic funds through a series of proxies and shell corporations to the Techno-Union, paying for the droids that even now bombarded the Republic blockade around Megiddo. They saved their evidence in triplicate, even as they kept searching. Judicial was brought in to keep track of the charges to be levied against Palpatine and sworn to utmost secrecy. They worked the clock around, ensuring their information was irrefutable. There was no question Palpatine was making a play for the Chancellor's office, with his call for a vote of no confidence in Fang Zar, and the idea of a Sith Lord at the head of the Republic was more than any of them could bear. They needed to destroy his reputation and break his political power wholly but rapidly. When they pulled together proof that Palpatine had orchestrated the Trade Federation's blockade and invasion of Naboo over a decade before, Obi-Wan knew they had their coffin nail. Most politicians would turn a blind eye to a certain amount of corruption, but to so egregiously work against one's own people and planet was all but unheard of. And conveniently, Obi-Wan and Jango were still inordinately popular on Naboo and had the trust of the young queen, Apalana. Gathering their information, Obi-Wan picked up Anakin, Padme, and Ahsoka just as they landed, promising to explain on the way. Obi-Wan's squad provided additional guards, and they were soon heading to Naboo at top speed. Padme was first aghast to learn her former mentor had been the one to arrange the subjugation of their people, and then enraged. Obi-Wan didn't blame her. Queen Apalana received them happily, although her smile soon faded when they presented their case. Almost instantly, she began planning to accompany them to Coruscant so she could publicly strip Senator Palpatine of rank and position for his crimes against the Naboo and Gungan people. Some of her handmaidens would remain behind to run the government in her absence, but she would be accompanied by others along with her security chief, Gregor Typho, and a Gungan honor guard. Obi-Wan flew his Ether Sprite, escorting Apallana's gleaming chromium-plated yacht as they descended on Coruscant a few days later. Padme had elected to travel with her queen, and so Anakin and Ahsoka, too, enjoyed the luxurious transport. When they disembarked, Padme was in the elaborate dress of a former monarch, lending her own considerable political acumen and experience to Apallana's cause. Senators went silent and stared as the two queens strode into the Senate dome. Apallana wore heavy velvets and brocades in black and gold and violet, her face painted in the smooth white mask that was traditional for monarchs of Naboo. Her upper lip and the scar of remembrance, though, were painted in matte black rather than the usual red, and on her cheeks were painted neither the peaceful red moons nor the less commonly seen blue tears of state mourning, but stark black lightning bolts. Padme wore identical lightning bolt marks on her face, although she wore no white paint beneath. The handmaidens, too, marked their faces with black lightning bolts, their deep hoods pulled back slightly so the paint on their cheeks were visible, even if their eyes were not. With the two painted queens, their phalanx of handmaidens and Gungan guards, a squad of guard troopers, and 3 Jedi, 2 clad in Beskar gown, and a third in a mix of Mando armor and Togruta huntress garb, they made quite the procession through the halls. In their wake, the gossiping senators and aides followed, wanting to see this new development firsthand. As Jango's Jedi liaison, Obi-Wan was afforded certain privileges in the Senate, and he took full advantage of them now that they were ready to move against Palpatine. Their group stepped onto the designated military platform, and Obi-Wan removed his boucher to expose his face, despite knowing everyone in attendance recognized his Beskar gown. The Vice-Chancellor nodded, acknowledging Obi-Wan so he could address the gathered sentients.
"Gentle beings of the Senate,"
Obi-Wan began, a more than slightly vulpine smile on his face. He spoke briefly about Megiddo, telling them for the first time that Sifo-Dyas was not the only Jedi found there, but that Master Dooku had been recovered alive and had recently awoken. It was information that had already been given to the committee dealing with the war, but not the whole Senate, and Obi-Wan doubted the committee had read that deep into the reports. As he spoke, the Force grew tense in anticipation, and Obi-Wan mentally prepared himself. They had all agreed that Palpatine was best confronted in public, despite the greater chance for bystander casualties. While the danger was high, so was the need for numerous witnesses. As he had planned with his compatriots, Obi-Wan stopped short of naming Palpatine. Instead, he turned the floor over to Padme. She stepped forward in a soft susurration of silks, dark eyes surveying the gathered assemblage, and spoke. She reported on what she had seen on Scipio and the data that had been retrieved there and the trail of corruption linking the Republic and Separatists together. She too stopped short of naming Palpatine and instead ceded the floor to Queen Apallana. "Sheev Palpatine," Apallana thundered, her voice ringing in the stillness. Knowing he was lost, Palpatine jumped, bounding from pad to pad, lightning sparking from his fingertips. Obi-Wan, Anakin, and Ahsoka quickly formed up around the queens, and a moment later, they were engaged. Palpatine moved swift and erratic, a crimson-bladed lightsaber in each hand. Obi-Wan and Ahsoka were both Jarkai practitioners themselves, though, and Anakin was well practiced against two-wielders. The Sith was formidable, but the Jedi held their ground. Lightsabers flashed fast and furious, the non-combatants doing their best to stay out of the way. It was Anakin who landed the final strike. Despite the Jedi prohibition against such intent, the 3 Jedi had all agreed beforehand that they must begin their fight with the assumption they would be fighting to the death. Surrender wasn't the way of the Sith, and so Anakin cut Sidious down, bisecting him from shoulder to hip. The 2 halves of his body landed heavily in the Naboo pod, and one of the handmaidens gagged discreetly but managed not to vomit. Silence settled heavily over the Senate, those watching holding their breath for a long moment, waiting to see if it was really over. "Sheev Palpatine was the Sith Lord known as Sidious." Apallana picked up where she had been interrupted. "We of Naboo cast him out and cast him down. We name him anathema, a traitor to our people and values. We give him over to the Jedi and let their justice be ours." The silence echoed resoundingly in the chamber. Abalana glanced to Obi-Wan and nodded. Obi-Wan dipped his head slightly to acknowledge the Queen, then guided the pod through the stunned silence back to the docking ring. Their procession exited the Senate as they had entered, only this time they bore the body of Darth Sidious among them. As they left the dome, it was clear the Gar and Jedi had been watching the live broadcast. Knights, Mando officers, and clone troopers formed up around them, ensuring their safety in case Palpatine had any contingency plans. For the next 3 days, Jedi shadows swarmed through Palpatine's offices and departments on Coruscant. Other teams were dispatched to go through his multiple residences on Naboo. Senate sessions began each morning with a listing of the atrocities the shadows had found the day before. There was no question that the Republic had narrowly escaped an even more dire crisis. Despite Palpatine's nature being revealed, though, his call for a vote of no confidence against Chancellor Czar couldn't be rescinded, and so the potential candidates for the chancellery busied themselves, avowing they'd never liked Palpatine much and certainly never benefited from his schemes. In all the bluster, Mon Mothma quietly amassed the voting bloc necessary to step into the power vacuum left behind, with the support of Bail Organa and much of the delegation of 2,000. It took a little longer for the war to stutter to a halt. Among the last gasps of the conflict, though, was the uprising of the remnants of Death Watch on Concordia and Mandalore, supplemented by criminals and malcontents brought in from other worlds. The Mando'a present in the Gar received the news with extreme displeasure, even more so when it became clear that the name had been revived by an outsider, a tall, tattooed Zabrak who claimed he would found a new Sith Empire. Savage Upras had resurfaced with a grudge against Republic and Mandalore alike. Kyr'tsad! Jango is the name of Death Watch's slur on his lips. Obi-Wan's own mouth pulled into a feral grimace, and he began to plan. A week later, 300 hot Mando'a descended on Mandalore with Obi-Wan at their head. Due to his contract with the Republic, Jango was unable to leave the Gar to retake his home system as he wanted, but Obi-Wan was more than willing to lead the charge in the name of his Mandalore. On the ground in Sundari, the city was a war zone. Savage's forces designated themselves with streaks and blots of searing neon yellow paint on their Bezgargam. Many of those who fought in the Sundari residence wore the sigil of an owl's face. The Night Owls, Obi-Wan soon learned they called themselves, and he was somewhat less than surprised when he learned they were led by Bo-Katan Kryze, who had otherwise kept to the strictures of her parole since leaving Death Watch herself. With Bo-Katan and her nephew, Corky, both at his side, Obi-Wan found Duchess Kryze held captive in the detention level of her own palace when they swept Sundari for any remaining hostiles. Going in, the hot Mando'a hadn't known whether or not the Duchess was alive or not. Her blue eyes widened almost comically at the sight of the Darksaber, though, and she gracefully and gratefully accepted hot Mando'a assistance while the war wound down in the Republic. The self-proclaimed Mandalore Savage was a bit more of a challenge. His skills as a fighter had improved since the last time he'd faced Obi-Wan on the field of battle. Against someone else, Savage might have prevailed. Against Obi-Wan, who was something of a specialist in Sith, Savage fought hard and was defeated. Seeing their nominal leader cut down by the Darksaber, most of the Death Watch commandos made the wise decision to surrender. Those who continued to fight paid with their lives. When the battle ended, the captured members of Death Watch were brought to trial in Sundari. Many were criminals brought in from outside the Mando culture to pad Savage's ranks. Those with charges pending in the Republic would be sent on to face those trials as well. Those who were Mando, when proven guilty, were sentenced to death for their treason. Almost uniformly, they were proven guilty. The Duchess argued for clemency, for exile instead of death. In the Duchess's opinion, exile, never to set foot on Manda'yaim or any of its colony worlds again, would be just as bad as death for the radical traditionalists still clinging to Death Watch teachings. While the Mando diaspora was numbered in the trillions, if not higher, and their people lived throughout the Northern Galaxy, the idea of being cut off from their home planet with no recourse and no chance for return was abhorrent to most Mando'a. Obi-Wan had no say in such matters, although he worried exile would only result in another group of disaffected Mando'a with a grudge in a few years. Obi-Wan returned to the temple, but many of the hot Mando'a remained on Manda'yaim. For them, the war was over. They would take up or returned to, positions as journeyman protectors throughout the sector, keeping the peace until Jango sent other orders. Even as Obi-Wan headed back to Coruscant, our Lefet loaded up all the young cadets from the last batches of clones decanted on Kamino and undertook the migration of the now much enlarged Fett clan back to Mandalorian space. Arla settled them on the Fett farm on Concord Dawn, although it was a tight fit. The community there rallied around her, and Shmi Skywalker was one of the first to come visit and offer help. It didn't take long for childless Mando'a to find their way to Ardla, carefully asking if there was any chance for them to take Ade home. With the help of the other hot Mando'a, Arla vetted such potential families carefully, but if they passed her stringent tests, the decision was left to the voter. Thus a few hundred clones found their ways by ones and twos into the population of Mandalore, Concordia, Draboon, Concordon, Varbaya, Shikut, and the many other habitable worlds of Mando space. Many more were adopted by hot Mando'a who settled throughout the sector. As soon as Obi-Wan was back in the temple, he was sent out on mission after mission. In an echo of the outset of the war, he was called upon as one of the foremost Jedi negotiators to hammer out ceasefires and truces, treaties of every sort to settle a tentative peace. When it was possible, Obi-Wan traveled with only the dedicated squad of troopers who had decided he was theirs to protect. Pons, Cody, Wolf, or Bly. Sometimes a larger force was necessary, and Obi-Wan would travel with a battalion, usually one of those commanded by his squad. Coordinating a ceasefire in Republic and Separatist space took months. A true peace agreement took even longer. Mira was 2 years old, toddling and babbling in Mando'a and Basic, before a solid peace was reached. The Senate weren't the only ones making difficult decisions in those days, though. The Order, too, had discovered more than a few issues that needed to be addressed. Once Jan had regained some of his strength, he made his opinions on all matters heard loud and clear, and this time the council listened a bit more closely.